Thank you for the introduction. My name is Abby, and I'm a PhD student at University of Southern California, and in the Department of Earth Sciences. So for anyone who studied earth science a long time ago, you probably studied it as geology. So a lot of programs now call themselves earth science because we've realized that rocks don't just stay rocks, right? There's a lot of interaction between the air and water. So I'm a perfect example of that. So I do study rocks in a way, but it's very related to climate and water. So that's why we call it earth sciences. Okay, and then my presentation today is about ocean acidification. So I'll just kind of explain the basics for people who aren't familiar with it, why it's happening, and how it might stop itself, or what we can learn about how the earth kind of regulates itself, and maybe do something with that information to slow this global problem down. Okay, before I get into science, I will tell you a little bit about myself, just to make my scientists seem more like humans. And believe it or not, I wasn't born a scientist. Like, it took me a lot of time and decisions to get there, so that's why this isn't a straight line. Okay, so I was born in Idaho, which a lot of people seem to have a hard time knowing where that is and confusing it with other states.
East of here, right?
What's that?
It's east of here somewhere?
Yes. So it's this one. And then for my undergraduate degree, I studied ecology. And my final project was focused on yak herding in the mountains of China, which is literally about as far from the ocean as you can possibly get on Earth. And that was really interesting, but I just didn't really understand research, and I wasn't really inspired to keep doing it. So I just got a job after undergrad, and I worked as a data analyst for a wind energy company. And I was there for about 4 years. And that was a really great experience, and it was exciting to be part of like a growing industry. But I realized I didn't want to be an engineer, and I didn't really want to be a business person. So like I didn't have the kind of like inspiration to really do a great job for the rest of my life. So I decided to try something else and go back to science. And so I got like a summer job as a research assistant, helping researchers do some work on lakes and the water chemistry of lakes. And that was great, so I was inspired to kind of do my own thing, and I applied for a research grant, and I got money to go to China and study very young mangrove forests. These are like brand new planted forests. And that was my first real like independent research experience, and I liked it, so I decided to do a master's, and I kind of got hooked on doing coastal chemistry, so I studied aquaculture for my master's and like how oysters impact water quality. And that was a pretty good experience, but I wasn't convinced I wanted to stay, or I wanted to be a scientist for the rest of my life. So I gave policy a shot, and I worked on I worked for NOAA in atmospheric and marine policy, international policy. And it took me less than a year to realize that I did not like policy as much as I liked science. So now I came back to science, and I'm really happy to be here. And I'm now trying to become a geologist. So if anyone has questions about just the career path of a scientist, later we can talk. So my current research is about ocean acidification. And if you're not familiar with ocean acidification, it's often referred to as the other CO2 problem. I've seen it referred to as global warming's doppelganger a couple of times, which is like a less catchy term for it. And then recent research is starting to show like all of the problems that acidification is having on marine biology. This is the part of the talk where I explain kind of how ocean acidification happens, why it's happening. So this figure shows atmospheric carbon dioxide over the last 400,000 years. So yes, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has gone up and down naturally, but as we get to current values or current years, it's just skyrocketing. So over the past 3 million years at least, it's never been this high. So we're at unprecedented levels. It's just skyrocketing. We're putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere way faster than the Earth has done it in millions of years. So even though we're we're putting a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, not all of it stays in the atmosphere. On average, about 30% of all the carbon dioxide we've put in the air is going into the ocean. So 30% dissolves into the ocean. And that's great for the atmosphere, right? Because it would be way hotter if the ocean weren't doing that. But there's some natural chemistry that happens when carbon dioxide combines with water. It forms this here, H2CO3, and that is carbonic acid. So ocean acidification is happening just because of basic chemistry of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere going into the ocean and forming an acid. And there's a good analogy I like to use. If any of you have one of these in your kitchen, maybe, this is just a soda stream. So you can think of the ocean as like the bottle of water and the atmosphere as like the cartridge of CO2. So we're literally soda streaming the ocean because we're increasing the pressure of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and it's going into the ocean. Okay, so the result of that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere going into the ocean, making the ocean acidic, can be represented by this plot. So since we've started recording atmospheric carbon dioxide, it's been going up every year. That's the red line. And then the green line is the CO2 in the seawater, so that's going up also. And then the pH of the ocean is going down, which means that acidity is increasing. So something I want to point out here is, even though this green line here is like below the red line, they're different axes, like these units are different for those two values. So there's actually way more carbon in the ocean than there is in the atmosphere. There's like 60 times more carbon in the ocean, dissolved in seawater, than there is in the atmosphere. So if we want to understand climate change and how it's affecting the planet and how the chemistry of the Earth might change, we really have to understand the carbon in the ocean. So that's kind of the theme of my research. Now's the top part of my talk where I tell you, do we care about ocean acidification? So is it affecting California? Yes, it's a global problem. So just like climate change, which is affecting the entire planet, ocean acidification is affecting the oceans everywhere. And in California specifically, these figures are from a study that used models to explain what was the ocean here like 200 years ago, what is it like now, and what will it be in the future. So this is only 30 years away now. So as you can see, the colors are getting more red. The ocean is getting more acidic, even right here. And these figures here are a side profile. So imagine you're looking at the ocean from the side. So the water is more acidic at the bottom of the ocean. But as we move forward in time, that acidic water is inching up to the top. So if any animals live in this water, if they live here, now they're experiencing very acidic conditions. I want to point this out because I'll be talking a little bit about it later. So this unit here is omega, which is a saturation state. And that basically means whether or not a carbonate rock is stable. So it's like a proxy for acidity. So if omega is above 1, it means the rock is stable. If omega is below 1, it means the rock will start dissolving because the water is too acidic.
That's where the red is?
Yeah, so anything in the red means that rocks will start dissolving. Carbonate rocks will start dissolving. And by 2025, the seafloor off of California will be permanently undersaturated with respect to this type of carbonate rock. So anything that makes its shell out of that type of carbonate will start dissolving. So as I alluded to on the last slide, animals that make their shells out of carbonate will be stressed. Like thermodynamically, they should dissolve, but they might be able to overcome that with just biology. But it's very stressful for them to constantly be, rebuilding their shell. So that's one impact. And then also new studies are starting to show that the ocean acidification can impact animal physiology and behavior. So fish can't smell as well, like they might get disoriented as the ocean becomes more acidic. And then finally, acidic water can release toxic pollutants from sediments. So basically, you're just changing a fundamental chemistry component of the ocean, so that can affect all chemistry that's happening. Okay, so how will ocean acidification stop? So to answer that question, we have to think like a geologist in like very long-term geologic time. So this is a picture of how carbon moves around the planet on millions of year scales. So there's carbon in rocks, a lot of carbon in rocks, and some of that might be exported to the atmosphere by volcanoes. So it turns into CO2 and it comes out of volcanoes. And now in like current civilization, we're pumping a lot of CO2 out from burning fossil fuels also. So that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere interacts with water and forms carbonic acid, like I already showed. And that carbonic acid starts to make rocks dissolve. So a lot of rocks will dissolve with acid. Some of them dissolve more easily, some of them dissolve. It's more difficult for them to dissolve. But when that happens, that's called weathering. It turns the carbon dioxide into harmless bicarbonate. So rocks dissolving sequesters carbon dioxide. That's how the chemistry works out. And then the type of rocks I'm studying are the ones formed by marine creatures, carbonate. So there's a lot of carbonate in the ocean that could potentially be dissolved by carbonic acid. And that's shown here. So this is a picture of a microscopic animal called a coccolithophore. They're really beautiful, and they build their shells out of carbonate. So we have a lot of this in the ocean, and then anything that builds their shell out of carbonate eventually turns into sand, right? Carbonate sand. And then eventually that will just turn into a hunk of rock, like limestone or eventually marble. And all of those things happen on such large scales that they make up a very large portion of the seafloor. So anything that's light blue or dark blue on this map is carbonate. So carbonate-covered seafloor. So there's a lot of this carbonate, and it dissolves easily. Compared to other rocks, it's quite easy to dissolve. So when it dissolves, it can sequester carbon dioxide. So I'm specifically asking the question, are carbonate sands reacting to ocean acidification? So are they dissolving because of ocean acidification? And I'm studying that specifically in sands, which in this map you can see line most of the continents. So these kind of, not the clay color, not the pink color, but all these other colors, most of this is sand. So as ocean water pumps through sand, you're getting acidic water interacting with a rock that dissolves relatively easily, and that could potentially sequester carbon dioxide. So the specific question is, does acidic water flowing through sand help neutralize carbon dioxide? And by neutralizing carbon dioxide, you balance the acidity of the ocean and cure ocean acidification. So how I'm asking this question is I'm using two different methods. One is a flow-through bioreactor, which is essentially a tube of sand, but that's often the term that scientists and engineers use. So I just pump water through sand, and then I see how the chemistry of the sand changes. So in these are bags filled with water. So I have bags filled with water, and then I pump the water up, and I measure the chemistry before it goes through the sand and after it goes through the sand. And then that's essentially the same as ocean water pumping through sand. So it goes in, and then it comes out. And I do this with natural water to represent current ocean conditions, and then I also acidify the water to represent future ocean conditions. So I can actually see how will the ocean change the chemistry of the water. And then I measure relevant chemicals like alkalinity and dissolved inorganic carbon. So I do that in these sand columns, and then I also do it out in the field in chambers. So you always need to compare your lab-based data to your field data. And so I was actually up at 4 a.m. this morning trying to deploy these just on the beach here. So this is just something I stick in the sand, and then there's something spinning to mix the water around, and it forces water in. So I did a lot of these experiments last summer, and I'm going to continue doing them this summer. And so I just have a few examples of what I found last summer. So these two data points here are from an experiment with current ocean conditions. So I didn't acidify the water. So this is the starting condition, and this is the end condition. And I know you don't need to understand what these metrics are, but the color here is important. So red is more acidic, and blue is less acidic. So in this experiment, we started here. This is ocean water, and it pumps through the sand, and it comes out like this. So in current conditions, water becomes more acidic as it pumps through sand. And that's not really surprising because there's a lot of microbes that live in sand. And just like us, they eat organic matter and they breathe out carbon dioxide. So when they breathe out carbon dioxide, it makes the water more acidic. So this is not surprising. Sand makes water more acidic. Okay, but these points down here are experiments I did where I made the water acidic for future ocean conditions. And then as the water flowed through the sand like this, the water doesn't come out, it comes out kind of similar, but slightly less acidic. So with future ocean conditions, these points, let's say these are for the year 2050 approximately. In 2050, you start to see this transition where sand is actually making the water less acidic. So rocks start dissolving and the water becomes less. And so these are just a few examples, but if I compile all this, everything I did last summer on one plot, these are different metrics, but the same kind of logic applies. So if you move to the left on the y-axis, this is moving into the future as the ocean becomes more acidic. So we're starting right here around omega-4, and then as we move this way, omega-2 for California is about the year 2050. All these points start moving up the x-axis. And the x-axis you can think about, as you move up, it's more buffering. So, if you cross the one line, you're transitioning from an acidifying condition to a buffering condition. So right now, as I showed on the previous slide, the sands are making water more acidic. But as we move into the future and eventually cross this one line, sands will make water less acidic. So currently, sands aren't helping, but in the future, at some point, sands will be helping ocean acidity. So that's at the cost of sands dissolving. Like a fraction of our beaches will dissolve, but the water will be neutralizing, or the sand will be neutralizing the water. Like I said, this is around 2050 for California. So sometime after California, we'll start to transition to a point where sands are neutralizing the water. So that's like good news, right, for ocean acidification, for like neutralizing the ocean. But that is going to take thousands of years for the entire ocean to be neutralized because, sandy beaches aren't that big. The continental shelf is not that big relative to the volume of the ocean. So some rough estimates, like the data that I'm producing is novel and this hasn't been done before, so it's only been modeled. But models indicate that neutralization can take 200,000 years. So again, this is like geologic timescales. It's good to know that it's happening and it can work, but if we want to take that information and apply it to technologies like geoengineering, this concept is actually something that people are talking about for geoengineering. So this figure here shows all of the different ways that we could potentially try to slow down climate change. And this one here, number 5, enhanced weathering, is what I've been talking about. So if we can find a way to speed up this water-rock interaction, then maybe it can be a way to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and help cure ocean acidification. And these are just some headlines from papers and like popular news stories about how enhanced weathering can actually be used to help solve climate change. So just the basic takeaways I wanted everyone to learn are ocean acidification is happening because of increased atmospheric carbon dioxide, and that natural rock-water chemistry can solve ocean acidification, but it'll take thousands of years naturally. And then also, I just like it when people know factoids, so I have a few pop quiz questions. And then hopefully you'll remember them after the pop quiz. So does anyone remember, and I know I just said this once, but what percent of anthropogenic carbon dioxide is absorbed by the ocean? Yeah, 30%. Right, that's great. And then there's a lot more carbon in the ocean than in the atmosphere. Does anyone remember how many times more carbon is in the ocean versus the atmosphere? Like, why is the ocean so important for climate studies?
60.
God, you guys are good. I thought no one would get these. So those are just like concepts that I think are important for people to remember to understand how important the ocean is. Even when we're talking about climate change, the ocean is a key part of that equation. And that's everything I have. I just left a lot of time for questions, so if you guys have any questions. Yeah.
I was actually going to ask you before this pop quiz, the 30% that gets absorbed, if you were to like freeze time, but allow that cycle to happen, would all of the CO2 eventually be absorbed by the ocean?
No.
Okay, so what defines the equilibrium between what stays in the environment, atmosphere versus the ocean?
So that's just like a basic chemical property, like PV equals nRT of like gas dissolving into solution. So it has to do with pressure and temperature.
Okay.
So
the partial pressure of the CO2.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And like unfortunately, as the planet gets warmer, less gas dissolves into the ocean.
Okay.
So we're actually like the ocean has been doing us a real solid by absorbing all this carbon dioxide. And in the future, it's going to be doing less of that because A, the planet's getting warmer, so less gas goes into solution, and then B, that chemistry is happening, and it's a buffer system, right? So it can only take so much before it can't take any more. So it's absorbing a lot of CO2 now, but as we keep moving that bar further along, it can absorb less and less.
I have a quick question.
Yeah,
so your samples, when you simulate pushing them forward in time by acidifying,
yeah.
How do you do it? You run them through a soda stream, or what do you?
No, some people do that. Like they just bubble water with CO2. I just actually add hydrochloric acid.
Oh.
And that's a kind of industry standard. Like lots of people acidify their water. So instead of making carbonic acid, you just add hydrochloric acid. Yeah, it's a shortcut.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in your models where you've been pumping kind of like 2050 future acidic water through the sand or the bioreactor, have you measured how much sand is depleted or?
No, it's very small. That's a good question. But at the acidity levels I'm measuring, it's not noticeable. It's noticeable through the chemistry, but not like through the mass. It's just too small. Yeah.
So have you tried like heat killing the like sand or anything to try to get rid of the microbes to just get like a baseline level of
like what's thermodynamic versus what's biological?
Yeah.
Yes, I have. It's complicated because when you heat kill, then you're changing you slightly change the mineralogy, right? Like you make clays expand or shrink. So it's very difficult to get an exact treatment or a controlled treatment. So I tried using poison, like just adding mercury to the water, and the chemistry didn't work out very well. That's something I've been thinking about, but I guess I'm more interested in answering like what's actually happening in the environment. And there's always going to be biology, so it would be interesting to tease apart the geological versus the biological input, but methodologically difficult, and I'm satisfied just replicating what's happening in the real world. But yes, we can talk more about it. Any other? Yeah.
How long does your water pump through your sand system? Does it like happen pretty fast? Or
It takes about 7 hours, and that's kind of like obviously the rate, like out here, how fast is water pumping through sand? Obviously that rate differs a lot based on where you are, what type of sand, whether it's a stormy day. But the rate I'm using, from what I've read in the literature, is like kind of a realistic rate of how fast ocean water comes through sand. So it's pretty slow. It's like I watch it drip. Yeah.
Would you have drastically different results on different varying degrees of like the shelf, like how the slope of like a beach is? If you have like, some beaches that run for 200 feet at like a reasonable expanding depth and then drop off versus some that, are 40 feet, 10 feet off the shore.
Possibly. I mean, that's more of like a physical oceanography question, like whether or not the flow is different at this level. And I don't want to say that's above my pay grade, but it's just outside the scope of my research.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's the thing. There's not a lot of measurements of how fast water is actually pumping through sand. There are measurements. We know it happens a lot. One paper I've read estimates that the entire volume of the ocean pumps through sand every 3,000 years, which is much faster than rivers delivering water to the ocean. So like on geologic timescales, this water is just like constantly cycling through sand. But measurements of actually how fast it's doing it are not very common, and no one, as far as I know, no one's done that as like different locations. That's probably more than you wanted to know.
No, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
How many years out do you think it would take at like kind of current levels to like notice a physical change of the coastlines?
Oh, with the sand, that's a really good question. I don't know. But given new like federal regulations, government scientists aren't allowed to talk about anything after 2040.
What?
That's the new administration's policy, because there's too much uncertainty in models beyond 2040.
Shut up.
Yeah, so.
That's in 2050.
Yeah. So who knows?
Wow.
Yeah, I don't know, and that would be more relevant for like carbonate beaches, like Hawaii or
Yeah.
Bahamas. The sands here are mostly not carbonate. Carbonate is a fraction of it, but you wouldn't notice a difference here for sure, because the carbonate that's dissolving is a very small. Don't worry.
What are the different concentrations of carbonate in sand?
So they tend to be like bimodal globally. So there's like high carbonate, which is like 100%, close, 80 to 100%. You're like, if you go to like a white sand beach, that's all carbonate shells. And then low carbonate. So here it's about 1%.
Oh, okay, so drastically different.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Is there anybody in the scientific community that would like not suppress this information, but be careful about sharing it, because the wrong person hearing this would just hear, "Oh, it's all going to fix itself. Don't worry about it."
I don't think so.
Okay, you haven't come across any like, "Oh, that's not what you,"
No, that's a
'Cause
really
there's a
good.
lot of people that are like, they hear, they don't understand enough, they just run with it. They're like, I heard this week,
Right.
and kind of leave it. Everything's fine.
Right. No, I'm
Take
very
care of it all.
aware of that.
200,000 is not good.
I'm very aware of that, and I try to be careful, but I should have put more like, this will take a very long time, or like big like warning.
Well, probably those people aren't going to sit here and
Yeah.
probably okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't seen anyone running with it. But it's funny because acidification seems to have like more support. Like it's less controversial than climate change, even though it's the same issue.
Yeah.
So, for example, my hometown representative to Congress is super conservative, and she's voted against any climate change bill. I think she's only voted for one once. Like 99% of the time, she's voted against climate change. But she is like championing an ocean acidification bill. So there's like it just hasn't been politicized. There's a big disconnect. But I don't know. I haven't seen anyone take this information. Yeah.
Since we're like right now, the sands are acidifying.
Yeah.
And we're already seeing like the terrible results of an acidified ocean with all coral reefs dying.
Yeah.
Do you know, like at the point when it starts to buffer, do you know what the projected acidity would be at that point? Like, is it already going to be destroying ecosystems?
Yeah.
Or
Well, first of all, coral reefs are mostly dying because of heat.
Okay.
So, I mean, this is an issue for them. It's more stressful, It's like, but thermodynamically, the buffering starts. The buffering starts around where omega equals 1. So that's the point at which rocks start dissolving. That's the definition of omega 1. So yeah, we can predict, when omega 1 will happen, and that's when things will start somewhere around there. But it's net buffering. It's not fixing the problem. It's just making the problem slightly better.
So you're saying we should kill all the microbes in the sand?
I'll. There are biologists in the audience.
One quick question. So obviously you're doing a lot of hands-on, like really, getting your results in person in the field and stuff. whether it's here at Catalina or over Santa Monica or whatever,
Yeah.
are you able to mine data that's being collected by other scientists and use that in your research at all, or a little too specific to be able to pull in
It's
data
a
from
little
around the
too
Pacific?
specific. There are only a couple of other papers that I know of that are looking at this similar issue, and they use different methods. So I could do like combine this with maybe one other data set that I know of, but it's a different method, so it's slightly.
Because I know NOAA ships are out there, doing water, samples from various depths all around the Pacific all the time and stuff.
Right.
Collecting all kinds of data. So I was curious if any of that was helpful in your research at all.
No, because so that map I showed of like the sandy areas of the planet. So most of those ships are off like in the deep ocean, right? And that's not sandy; it's all like very fine clay. So that's the difference. This isn't happening in the middle of the ocean. It's just diffusion.
Right.
So this is like a very nearshore process. Well, it's like the shelf, the entire shelf, which on the west coast is very nearshore, but on the east coast is much wider. And there's not that. People have neglected the shelves because it's such a small area, but there's way more carbonate in the shelves. So, hope you guys learned something about like the big long-term carbon cycle.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.